strong emphasis on what the Lord accomplished for us on the cross in our place. We are encouraged to endure suffering for His glory because Jesus modeled that for us, did He not? It is Father's Day. We have said before, the categories we say over and over again here at Gospel Life Church, the responsibilities of our men is to listen, to learn, to lead, and it's also to provide, to protect, and to preach. Those are the categories. So listen, learn, lead, and to provide, to protect, and preach. We define masculinity this way. Masculinity takes responsibility. Masculinity takes responsibility, and that happens in two ways. We can break that down into two ways. Men take responsibility by taking on responsibility. What is the responsibilities? What are the primary responsibilities that men take on willingly as warriors, as courageous warriors? To listen, learn, lead, to provide, to protect, and to preach. That's the responsibility they take on. The other responsibility that men take on is, hey, it's ultimately my responsibility. If my family is struggling, if my family is faltering, I don't point the finger, I take the responsibility. The buck stops here. That's how we define masculinity. So I want us to challenge. I've been challenging, as we've been challenging the young men in our group on Thursdays. Here's what our emphasis is this morning with reference to fathers. I just want to encourage you, men. Maybe you're not a father yet, but you'll be a future father. I want to encourage you, inspire you to continue on. If you feel like you've been failing, you feel conviction this morning, amen to that. There is still opportunity ahead of you to be the kind of man that God is calling you to be. So here's how we're going to break it down. Men, we need to reject passivity. We need to reject passivity. We see a lot of passivity in the Bible with reference when it comes to men. Who was the first man to show passivity with reference to leading his family? Adam. We know the text is clear in Genesis as that Eve decides to take the fruit. Who is immediately within her proximity, within the immediate vicinity of Eve doing that? Who stands idly by, passively by, and allows his wife to make that choice without seeking to jump in to provide for her spiritual leadership, to protect her from making this grave mistake. Passivity with Adam. And we're going to look at another example of that as our primary example later on in just a moment. So reject passivity, men. Secondly, take responsibility, as we've already said. Thirdly, lead courageously. Be the hero in your own families. What sense does it make to be the hero any other place, any other venue, if you're not a hero in your own home? We see this repeatedly. Men are awesome in this venue, in this arena, in this career, or in this place, but in their own home, they feel like, hey, the mission, I'm not on mission, I don't need to be the hero. The home is our first place of ministry. It's our little flock, it's our little gospel community that we need to see it as, hey, this is my primary mission. This is where I need to lead courageously and be the hero for that family. See, the thing is, we don't immediately reap the benefit for the seeds we sow, do we? We don't get instant gratification from seeking to lead courageously. It's years, sometimes decades down the road where we begin to reap the fruit from that. So we need to have a vision. We're fighting for the inner life, the inner spirit of our children. And sometimes fathers will come within our congregation and they'll say, hey, I want to talk to you. What do they want to talk to me about? They want to talk, hey, my son is doing this. This is happening with my son. And basically they say, hey, you know what? I don't want to take responsibility. I don't want to lead courageously. Timothy, I want you to handle it. And you know what the chances of success with that are? Virtually none. I can't replace you, fathers. I can't replace you, men. The amount of time, Deuteronomy chapter 6, 4 through 6, teaches men, fathers, to say, lead your child at every step during the day. At every point. Speak to them. Teach them. I can't be there to make up that deficiency for all those hours that fathers can spend with their children. I can't make up for that. So, man, I just say you're irreplaceable. You're irreplaceable. We need you to lead courageously. Next, we need you to see, fourthly, to invest eternally. Eternal investment. We said that the benefit you receive, the reaping the reward, it's often not going to be in this life, it's in the life to come. So we're in seeking to invest eternally. How often do we, men, the temptation is to live for instant gratification, to live for things that there's no eternal reward. No eternal reward. So again, I'll just repeat those by way of introduction. Men, we need to reject passivity. We need to take responsibility. We need to lead courageously, beginning in our own homes. And fourthly, we need to invest eternally. Invest eternally. One way to invest eternally is when you go on mission, you always bring someone with you. One man that I greatly respect, you'll hardly ever see this man without his family with him, no matter what he's doing. He brings his sons with him. And as a result, he's got a bunch of mini-me's around with him. Here's the idea. The idea is, I fell into great temptation in my teenage years. And I love my dad, an amazing, amazing man I have utmost respect for. Our relationship somewhat broke down in my teenage years, and due to just normal constraints of life, he was trying to put food on the table. He was thrown into a new situation, and he had to work all these hours, and as a result of that, he and I no longer had the relationship where he's pouring into me on a regular basis like he had always done. I needed unconditional love. I needed acceptance. These are things that we need. These are human needs, right? And so I was susceptible to meeting those needs in every other place. And the place I just so happened to come into where I could have those needs met is a very destructive, damaging set of friends. And I want to say this. If the home life is what God has designed it to be, it protects children from being susceptible, from being vulnerable to all those other things out there in the world. Remember last week, we used the illustration of a father and a husband is like a soldier who has a mine detector leading a group of soldiers through a minefield, right? And if the soldier has the mine detector, the other soldiers are going to follow closely in his footsteps, right? And so what happens with men is we can fall into one of two traps. We can be just overly firm and restrictive and just rule-based. And we act like when we say, thus saith the Lord, thus saith Dad, we mean thus saith the Lord. It's like it's rules. And we can provoke our children to anger that way. And the other thing is, trap we can fall into is to be overly permissive. Overly permissive. You know what? Do whatever you want, son. I don't care. Do whatever you want. The thing is, we need neither one of those ditches on either side of the road actually gets into the heart of the child, does it? It doesn't dig deep. And that's really what the role of the father is, to dig deep. And that's where we want to get to today. But I want to say this. If the home, and I've seen this, so I'm not just making this up. When the home life is everything that it can be and should be, the children are far less vulnerable and susceptible to all those temptations out there because the home life is so amazing. Now, the example, I want to take us through a narrative in our Old Testaments, and we're going to look at King David this morning. And we're going to begin in 2 Samuel chapter 12. 2 Samuel chapter 12. So I'm going to move somewhat quickly through this narrative. Do you guys realize what the single greatest threat, struggle that King David ever went through in his life? Do you know what that was? Well done. Absalom. Is that what you said? I think it's what you said. His son, Absalom, and the rebellion that he exhibited was the greatest struggle that King David ever went through. It wasn't Goliath. It wasn't even running from King Saul all those years. It was actually, as the book of 2 Samuel spends a lot of time, it was his son Absalom. Now, I want us to follow, Absalom, I believe was his third-born son, caused him all this trouble. But how did that happen? How did it come to be that King David's own son would rebel against him and actually led all of Israel when they had been all for David? Absalom used to sit out at the city gates, and when people would come to see David to have him give a judgment on some matter, he would just kind of slip in there and say, hey, you know what? I'm sorry, King David can't see you. I can see you. And if I was leading Israel, this matter would be handled in the way it should be. And doing this for year after year, he just kind of slipped in there secretly, and suddenly he had all of the affection of the nation of Israel, and then he used that affection, that loyalty that he gained. How did he use it? To turn against his father. And what was the result of him turning against his father? King David and his household had to flee from Jerusalem. To flee from Jerusalem. How does that happen? Now, the book of Samuel, 2 Samuel here, it has a particular theme, and it has a particular goal that it wants to accomplish. One of the primary goals that the book of Samuel wants to accomplish, as it wants to show the people of Israel how it is that the house of Saul stopped being king, ruling the nation, and how did King David and his line come into prominence. That's one of the primary things it's seeking to do. And even after David became king and he had these struggles with Absalom, how is it that Saul's lineage didn't come back to be king again? How did that all happen? So the sense in which Samuel's overarching theme is justifying the kingship of David. And when you see it that way, all of Samuel kind of comes together and makes a lot of sense. You see the continuity between each chapter. Now, if we all know that King David, it's said that he was a man after God's own heart. We all know, if you know anything about King David, and by the way, it didn't used to be believed by society at large that King David was an actual legitimate historical person. It is now believed that he existed by society at large. But if anybody knows anything about King David, it's what? David and, okay, Goliath, Rich. But we're coming to that. David and Goliath, he has the sling, right? And he kills the giant, and he's the hero for the nation. It's a great story. And what we learn from that is David was courageous. He was leading courageously on the battlefield, wasn't he? He was a hero. He was a warrior. But the question is, was David a hero? Was David a warrior with reference to his own home, in his own house? So we want to hear about this. So let's follow the narrative. So that's happened. David is ruling now. And let's pick up the story in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 7. No, I got to set it up just for the sake of time. David has had a lot of victory in his military exploits. And such that he eventually sends off his general and his army to do the fighting by themselves. And what does David do? He's back. He's at his castle, if you will, at his home. And he sees a beautiful woman, Bathsheba, a woman that is not his wife. He sees her from across the way. Bathsheba is another man's wife. He invites Bathsheba over. He commits adultery with her. And what does he do? He invites her husband Uriah back home from the battlefield and tries to get Uriah to go sleep with his wife so that what he did with his wife can be covered up. Is that sneaky and is that shady? Uriah refuses to do that. So what does he do? What does plan B? He sends to his general and says, send this man where the battle is fiercest, and then pull back on him. And as a result of that, King David, has David, the husband, killed, murdered. Those choices that David made with Bathsheba, with Uriah, the Hittite, affect not only David, but his whole family tree for the rest of David's life and beyond. That choice that David made when failing to lead courageously, failing to take responsibility, failing to be the spiritual leader of his home, affects not only David, but his family for the rest of his life. And so David has committed this sin, and he's committed adultery and he's committed murder. Heinous sins in God's sight. And the result of that, he's kind of made it, covered it up. He's gotten away with it, if you will, right? And he doesn't seem to sense any conviction for it whatsoever. Again, a man who in Psalm 119 says, "O Lord, how I love your law." Again, a man who said to have a heart after God's own heart. A man after God's own heart. So what does God do? God was not pleased. God sees this, and he sends his prophet Nathan to convict David. And the way he convicts David is by telling a story. And David he tells a story, and then he turns to David and he says, beginning in verse 7, "Then Nathan the prophet said to David, 'You are the man. You're the man I've been talking about who's guilty of the sin. You're the man that I'm talking about who you just responded to by saying this man should be killed. You are the man. The Lord, the God of Israel says, I anointed you king of Israel and saved you from the power of Saul. I gave you your master's house and his wives and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And if that had not been enough, I would have given you much, much more. Why then have you despised the word of the Lord and have done this horrible deed? For you have murdered Uriah the Hittite with the sword of the Ammonites and stolen his wife. From this time on, your family," here it is, verse 10, "From this time on, your family will live by the sword because you have despised me by taking Uriah's wife to be your own. This is what the Lord says, because of what you have done, I will cause," here it is again, "your household to rebel against you. I will give your wives to another man before your very eyes." That other man, you know who it ends up being? Is Absalom, his son. "And he will go to bed with them in public view. You did it secretly, but I will make this happen to you openly in the sight of all Israel." Now what happens? David has a son with Bathsheba. And as a result of God's judgment on this sin, that child is taken. That child dies. But that was not the end of the punishment. And so we just read that in chapter 12, but notice how chapter 13 begins. Chapter 13, verse 1. "Now David's son, Absalom, had a beautiful sister named Tamar." Now, David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister named Tamar, and Amnon, her half-brother, fell desperately in love with her. What we read further is that Amnon raped his sister Tamar, his half-sister Tamar. And you say, well, what does that got to do with Absalom? Verse 1 of chapter 13 says, "Now David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister." The reason why that's mentioned is because this act of Amnon, who is the firstborn, is going to affect Absalom very greatly. And it's actually, this act is what's going to be the catalyst for the judgment that God has already promised on David's line. Now, what would your result be? What would your response be if you heard that one of your children had done such a heinous act and you were the king of the nation? What was your, we have this idea in the New Testament that we want to gospel our children. We want to gospel each other. And by the way, much of what I'm going to say about fathers is directly going to be relevant to all of our discipleship relationships. It's going to be very relevant to how we treat our coworkers and how we treat our spouse, how we treat our children, of course, how we treat our relatives and our neighbors, even strangers and even our enemies. So, look for the relevance. David's response to hearing that one of his sons had raped one of his daughters was this. In 2 Samuel 13, verse 21. "When King David heard what had happened, he was very angry. And though Absalom never spoke to Amnon about this, he hated Amnon deeply because of what he had done to his sister." That's it. That's all the text records with reference to David's response to this heinous sin that had taken place. He was very angry. Now, my question is, if you're angry, okay, first of all, is it righteous indignation or is it, sinful anger? But What are you going to do about it? The question I would have for David is, David, as a leader of not only the nation, but of your family, what are you going to do to restore order in your home? What are you going to do to restore reconciliation in your home? The text records that David does nothing. And it just festers there. And it's almost as if he forgets and he's just waiting for, let's just let things calm down. He doesn't deal with the situation at all. You know who doesn't forget? Absalom. He's still very upset and angry about what happened to his half-sister. So, hey, Dad's not going to handle it. Dad is actually being passive in the situation. Oh, he's angry, but what good does it do? He's still very passive. He's not acting. He's not intervening to bring about reconciliation in his family. He says he's angry, but that's it. So 2 years pass. You know what Absalom does? He's biding his time. He's waiting for people to forget. And so he says to his dad, David, he says, hey, I want to throw a party for the king's house. And all the family is invited to come. And David says, I can't come. But, you know, and that's too much for you to have this party. Absalom insists, and David doesn't even come to the party. But Absalom says to David, I really want to invite my brother, Amnon. Now, you would think David would say, why is he interested? You know, where's his, intuition at least? But David doesn't pick up on that, and so allows Amnon to come. And what happens as a result? Absalom had thrown this whole party merely to get Amnon there, and what does he do while he's there? He kills him. He kills his brother because he's still angry and upset over what he had done, shaming his sister Tamar. What is David's response to that? We read in verse 37 of chapter 13. Verse 37 of chapter 13. And David mourned many days for his son Amnon. Absalom fled to his grandfather, Talmai, son of Amminahud, the king of Geshur. He stayed there in Geshur for 3 years, and King David, now reconciled to Amnon's death, longed to be reunited with his son Absalom. So Absalom leaves, and he's gone for 3 years. And the text records that, so David's sad, he grieves, I lost a son. But again, my question is, what are you going to do about it, David? There is all kinds of dysfunction and destruction in your home. What are you doing about it? David mourned many days. And when it says in verse 39, King David now reconciled, he got used to the fact, he's like, this happened. But what did he do about it? Absalom leaves, and the text records David longed to be reunited with his son Absalom. That's what the text records, but you know what? He may have longed to be with his son Absalom, but what did he do about it to be with his son Absalom? But let's continue reading, because we got to get the whole story here. So 2 Samuel chapter 14. Joab arranges for Absalom's return is the chapter heading. In verse 14, verse 1, we read, Joab realized how much the king longed to see Absalom, so he sent for a woman from Tekoa. Basically, Joab tricks David into calling for his son to return. Long story short. And this woman comes and tells the story and says, hey, at the end, she says, hey, you know what? Long story short, David says, did Joab put you up to this for me to be reconciled with my son? So what's happening is the people around David are saying, oh, yeah, he says he wants to be reconciled with his son. He mourns for his son. He wants to be back reconciled with Absalom, but he's not doing anything about it. So Joab has to trick, by using this woman of Tekoa, tricks David into calling for Absalom to return back to Jerusalem. And we read in verse 21, so the king sent for Joab and told him, all right, go and bring back the young man Absalom. Joab bowed his face to the ground in deep respect and said, "At least I know that I have gained your approval, my lord, the king, for you have granted me this request." Then Joab went to Geshur and brought Absalom back to Jerusalem, but the king gave this order: Absalom may go to his own house, but he must never come into my presence. So Absalom did not see the king. Wait a minute, did you guys catch that? I thought David was longing to be reconciled with his son Absalom. He's saying that. He's angry about what happened with Tamar, and then he's sad about what happened with his son Amnon being killed by Absalom. And he says, I really want to be with my son. I really want to be with my son. But then he has to be tricked into bringing his son back. And then when he comes back, he says Absalom can only go to his own house. He can't come to mine. So my question is, does he really want to be reconciled with his son? And verse 24 ends by saying, so Absalom did not see the king. Verse 28, same chapter, Absalom lived in Jerusalem for how long? 2 years. So this is 5 years after the fact of him killing his brother. 7 years after what happened to Tamar, right? It's still, now it's this shame, it's embedded in the family. It's not been dealt with. It's just festering still. There's destruction in the wake of it. David is not leading courageously, is what I'm seeing. Verse 28, Absalom lived in Jerusalem for 2 years, but he never got to see the king. Then Absalom sent for Joab to ask him to intercede for him, but Joab refused to come. Absalom sent for him a second time, but again, Joab refused to come. He's sending for Joab to say, hey, Joab, I want to see my dad. Joab says, David's not going to see him, so he won't even come and entertain the thought of being asked to go get David to see his son. So you know what Absalom does? And I think this is very interesting because children will often do this to get their parents' attention. Hello, right? How does Absalom say, hello, Dad, I'm here? So Absalom said to his servants, verse 30, go and set fire to Joab's barley field, the field next to mine. So they set his field on fire as Absalom had commanded. That's a good way to get someone's attention. Set a field on fire, right? Ruin the crops. Ruin someone's, sustenance for the year. Did it work? How many would think that would work? Yeah? It's like, okay, you won't see me. I'm going to get your attention. I'm going to make it so you have to deal with me. Verse 31, then Joab came to Absalom at his house and demanded, why did your servants set my field on fire? Don't we, hello, don't you know? I mean, did you think he was just going to forget about it? It's like kind of a silly question to ask. And Absalom replied, because I wanted you to ask the king why he brought me back from Geshur if he didn't intend to see me. I might as well have stayed there. Let me see the king. If he finds me guilty of anything, then let him kill me. He's like, I'm going to do whatever it takes to see my dad. And if I have to cause destruction, I'm going to cause destruction. But hey, why did he call me back here if he wasn't going to see me? And do you see how the bitterness, after all these years, is being embedded in his son Absalom's life? Let me see the king. If he finds me guilty of anything, let him kill me. Verse 33, so Joab told the king what Absalom had done. Then, what does the text say? Then at last, David summoned Absalom, who came and bowed low before the king, and the king kissed him. Finally, they're reconciled, right? Now, what happens after this? So he's welcomed back. But you know what? He has a plan. This is when Absalom begins sitting at the gate and getting people's loyalty towards himself. At this point, 7 years later, Absalom is completely bitter against his father. And so what does he do? It's mutiny. He says, I'm going to take over the kingdom from my father. And he begins collecting the loyalty of all the people. And as a result, Absalom was very successful. He got the loyalty of the whole nation of Israel and Judah in spite of all that David had done. Isn't it amazing? After all that David had done for the nation of Israel, Absalom was able to trick them into having loyalty for himself. And as a result, King David at one point has to flee his own home in Jerusalem, his own house. And he's now in exile from his own son. Now, long story short, Absalom is gathering the troops, and he goes to battle against his own father. And he knows his dad is a mighty warrior. That's the one thing the text records. You know what? David and his mighty men, they're warriors. So you better get some good counsel if you're going to go out and fight against your father. And they know that. And you have to give it to David. He's a warrior on the battlefield. The Lord helped David. And David at one point was fleeing. And the text records that his hair, which he had an amazing head of hair, the Bible records, very heavy, we're told, gets caught in a thicket, some trees, if you will, and he's left there hanging, he's stuck. Joab finds him, and Joab's mad about him for something else, and so he stabs him 3 times. Kills David's son. David had already given the command previously, if you find my son, go easy on him. He's my son. Joab completely disregarded that command of the king and kills Absalom, David's son. And how does David respond when he hears it? This is coming to the end of the story, the point we want to make. The end of that part of the story is 2 Samuel 18, verse 33. The king was overcome with emotion. He went up to the room over the gateway and burst into tears. As he went, he cried, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." And I want to say, at that point, it was too late. Clearly, it's too late. Absalom is dead. And it's like he expresses this emotion, David does, when these events happen. But it's a sense in which for me, just reading the text, it seems like that's all he did. That's all he did. He expresses emotion. David's a very emotional guy. Great. We have some amazing psalms written in his hand that express a powerful emotion. But he doesn't act. He doesn't act in his family to do anything when these things take place. And so here's what I see. The whole sequence of events that unfolds, culminating in Absalom's death after Amnon dies, and all these terrible things that happen in his family is all a result of David not being the spiritual leader of his home he should have been. I mean, committing adultery, that's breaking one of the 10 commandments, is it not? The king, one of the primary responsibilities of the king was to know the whole law. He was supposed to write out his own copy so he would know it so well. The whole law, 613 commands, of course that includes the 10 commandments. And one of those, of course, is do not commit adultery. Don't covet your neighbor's wife. David does that in his sin. And it's not like God was like, hey, I'm going to get you, David. Okay? So we're talking about man's responsibility and God's sovereignty in some sense here briefly. It's not as if like, hey, God's like, you know what, to punish you, I'm going to sneak in and I'm going to ruin your family for you, David. You know what God did, I believe, in looking at the whole overarching story, is God just stepped back. He just stepped back. Hey, David, you don't want to acknowledge me as king of your life? You want to be king of Israel and also king of your life and not submit to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords? I'm just going to step back and see what your actions, where they take you. And that's going to be your punishment. And we have already read, David should have already known the sins of the fathers, we're told, in 2 places in the law. The sins of the fathers visit themselves to the children, to the 3rd and 4th generation. And isn't David's life an expression of this? Because what did God already say to him at the original judgment? He says, the sword is not going to depart from your household. And there was just chaos and conflict perpetually throughout the rest of David's lineage. Now, David's lineage culminates in who? This person we're all really excited about, God, through Jesus, right? We're big fans of Jesus. So you see how Jesus was able to turn around his family tree? Okay, and bring many sons to glory. Isn't that amazing? How one man Jesus rejected passivity. Jesus led courageously. Jesus took responsibility, especially on the cross, for the sins of the world, so he could have a family, that we could all be adopted into the family. Jesus invested eternally. That's why we are all sitting here 2,000 years later. So Jesus is the ultimate David. And we praise God for that. But with David, what we see is, with his punishment really, was God saying, you know what, you want to go your own way? I'll let you go your own way. And you see the destruction in his path. Men, I just want to encourage us this morning, we have to reject passivity. We have to reject passivity with our families. And I just want to ask you a question. You know, what should David have done? Do we see prisons in the Old Testament? I mean, people are brought into captivity, but we don't see prisons the way we would see them today in America. What should David have done to reconcile, to bring about reconciliation in his family? What should he have done? What options did he have? I mean, what are the punishments in the Old Testament? Well, basically, slavery and death, you know. Keep it simple. Slavery, you know, prison system costs us a lot of money. So, hey, we're going to, instead of it costing us money, we're going to use it to be productive. We're going to have slavery, and then it doesn't cost anything to execute someone. So I'm just asking you, what should David have done with his own son? Should he have sent him into exile for a while? The reason I'm asking that question is because in the New Testament, in the church, we have the Holy Spirit that brings about conviction in our hearts. And we face things head on, men. We don't just, passive and say, I just hope the problem will go away. Does the problem never just go away? So what we're told to do, like Jesus did on the cross, he says, Lord, if there be any way possible, let this suffering, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, let not my will, but thy will be done. And he takes responsibility. He leads courageously. He does all these amazing things because he faces it. Jesus does. And he models that for us as men. I want to encourage us men. What David could have done is, as Cliff has reminded us, he could have dealt with the problem. He could have faced it. He could have talked with his sons. He could have brought about a punishment for Amnon that would have satisfied Absalom. But here's the thing, man. Today, if we're really going to gospel each other, and what do I mean by gospeling each other? That means we treat each other the way God treated us. Is God patient with us? Does God care about our well-being? Does he care about what's going on in our lives? Does he care about our heart? Does he care about our motives? Oh yeah. That's where God's looking. He's looking at the heart. That's all he's looking. He's looking at the heart and the motives all the time. And so the permissive father doesn't look at the heart, doesn't look at the motives. Hey, why does my son want to do what he wants to do? And the father who's just rules, also isn't looking at the heart of the child either. Finding out, why is my child doing what they're doing? So I want to give us a strategy this morning for how we can do that. Now, we've been going through, I want us to remind us, and I want to remind us this morning that David was a great warrior but a bad father. Success in one area of life does not guarantee effectiveness at home. The father's role is to bring their children to a place of maturity, to the ultimate reaches of their human potential, so they can flourish on their own. The object of parents, the object of a father is not to cause their child to be dependent on them, but the object is to bring them to maturity, including spiritual maturity, so they can stand on their own 2 feet one day and navigate through life with wisdom. And I want to encourage you, fathers, here today. You may not be able to do anything about your ancestors, but you have the opportunity to do something about your descendants. And it's never too late. It's never too late. And if you say, I failed in so many ways, I want you to get this. If you have failed in so many ways in the past and you feel discouraged right now, and you say, I don't even know where to begin. You know how you begin? You take responsibility. You take responsibility. This is where the family is like, whoa, recalibration. Dad's doing something we haven't seen him do. He's actually saying, I'm sorry. Will you forgive me for, and naming something specific, and waiting for a response. That's how men begin to lead, is by taking responsibility for their own sin. We can't call people out on their. How can you lead a child and call them out on things they're doing poorly when you have all kinds of unconfessed sin in your own life? What do children see that as? Hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. And believe me, I believe this firmly, that children pick up more from what by catching things than necessarily by what is taught. If the actions don't meet the words, the child's like, I don't have to listen to that. There's no consistency. There's no coherence. And so children pick up on what's said versus what is done, right? So what's a good example of this? You know, children know when their parents are serious, when their dad is really serious. You know, the whole counting to 10, and then you're going to get it, kid. What does that teach the kid? Dad doesn't mean it when he says it. He actually doesn't mean it until he gets around, 8 or 9. And he really means it when he says 10. That's when he means it. So I don't have to do it when he says to do it. I just got to wait for him to count down. Okay? Or I have to wait for his voice to get a certain level of decibels. Then I know he's serious. We got to be men of our word. I want to say this. The idea for teaching, as we read last week in Ephesians chapter 6, fathers, it says fathers. Notice it says fathers, verse 4 of chapter 6 of Ephesians, are to bring their children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, or in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Fathers have the primary responsibility in a household. That's the structure that God has designed. You can't have two masters. You know what I mean? Jesus himself says no man can serve two masters. You love one and hate the other, and vice versa. The thing is, there has to be unity, doesn't there, in a household? Mother and father have to be united, because children will actually, use that to their own advantage like so quickly, right? They play one off the other, so that we know there has to be. I want to say this, wives, and mothers, the best way one of the best ways you can lead your children is to support the husband. The child has to see unity. Because otherwise they only see opportunity to divide in order to get what their own fallen nature wants. But I want to say in Ephesians chapter 4, 20 through 21, we read this, but that isn't what you learned about Christ, since you have heard about Jesus and have learned the truth that comes from him. Fathers, I want to say this, children learn Christ by how their fathers' lives are being shaped by Christ. It is not sufficient to just teach a Bible lesson if your life doesn't line up. The primary way I learned what it meant to be a Christian is by watching my dad be one. And I know the fact that he took me aside and taught me what it meant to be a Christian man happened as a result of him being a Christian man himself. Not, I got to check the box of I taught my son. I saw that it was flowing, him teaching me and discipling me and letting me observe his life flowed out of his love for God. He was merely inviting me into that relationship he already had. There has to be that authenticity. And I have to keep moving quickly here, but we'll do that in community group. Can I just remind you, fathers, you have great influence. You ever feel like, you're minimized or, like we said last week, emasculated and you're disrespected? And what do men do? What do men do when they feel emasculated or disrespected? They retreat, right? They put walls up. They said, okay, because sometimes when men say, I haven't been leading in my household, and they step up to try to lead, maybe for the first time in a decade, what happens? Oftentimes they get shot down because they haven't built the trust up yet. And so the wives can often say, hey, I want my husband to lead, but when they seek up to try to lead, they get shot down because they're not trusted and they get disrespected. And men they retreat back. And they put up these walls and say, okay, you won't let me lead, you're going to disrespect me in front of the kids, I'm not going to lead, I'm out of here. And so it can be possible for wives and mothers to shoot themselves in the foot if you want, but men need to be inspired and encouraged along the way. The wives and the mother need to come alongside of their husbands to support them. And ultimately what we learn from that is it's not ultimately most important that he makes the best decision, but that he is allowed to make the decision so he can begin leading his family and learn from that mistake and get back up and lead even better the next time. We can't circumnavigate the whole process. So there has to be unity. And I want to say that fathers have this great influence. And so men, if you failed in the past, be encouraged. There's hope for the future. There's hope for the future. You have great influence over your children. The question is, what are you going to do with that influence? And fathers, if you have failed in the past, and there's no perfect fathers except for one Heavenly Father, and even his two children, Adam and Eve, rebelled. Okay? So we want to stay balanced. But if you've been given great influence, the question is, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with it? If it's true that the sins of the fathers visit themselves to the children, to the third and fourth generation, can we use that as to our benefit? You say, it's true that the sins of the fathers visit themselves to the children, to the third and fourth generation. How might we use that truth to our benefit? What good can we get out of that? Can we learn something from that? So, are you scratching your head? Do you have any ideas? How can we turn that somewhat what I could call a curse? How can we turn that into a blessing? Or another way of putting that, and I think you're right on the right track, use it as a diagnostic. Say, you know what? It is of a necessity, of a truth that my sins are going to be visited to my children. What do I see in my children that I don't like? If you've been a passive father, you know what? Where are those sins in me? How can I get that right in my own life? And or if you know the sins in your own life, say, you know what? Are these being expressed in my children? Can I get it right in my own life and then approach them and challenge them, hey, son, I am sorry for the bad example I've done. I realize in my own life I need to repent in this area. I have failed in this area, but son, my deep concern, because I love you so much, is that I have failed and I've been a poor model for you in this area, and I'm deeply concerned. I need to get it right with you, son, now. I need to ask your forgiveness. I've gotten it right with God, but son, please see this, because we got to get our family tree strong, planted by the rivers of life. And so we use that to say, hey, if I get things in my own life, I can use it to help my children and turn that curse into a blessing and go after those things. Children are greatly influenced by their fathers. I can tell you, my first word was, ready for it? Dada. You know what that means? It means dad. It means father. And my father continued to exercise great influence in my life, and he does to this day. And it's either going to be a negative or a positive. What's it going to be, men? Because as we said last week from Proverbs, the glory of children is what? Is who? Their fathers. Their fathers. The glory of children is their fathers. So here's 4 things. We're so out of time, so I just want to give you 4 things. We used the illustration last week. Hey, quit hitting your sister. Right? Does that get to the heart of the matter? Just stop it, kid. You're annoying me. You're being naughty. Stop doing what you're doing. And I'm not saying you can deal with the situation every single time, but the idea we said last week is fathers got to get to the heart of the matter. And that means echoing the Heavenly Father, saying, hey, we got to deal with the motives. We got to look at the heart. Why is the child doing what they're doing? We got to get to the sin beneath the sin, the motivation that manifests itself in the action of the sin. So the first thing is we look at the situation. What is happening? What is happening? The situation. What's going on? The second thing is the responses. What does the person do? What does my child do in response to what's going on? Every time this thing happens, my son or daughter is tempted to do this. So we look at the situation. We look at the responses. The third thing we look at are the thoughts. What does my child think about the situation? What does my child think about what's going on, about the situation, the circumstance? So we put ourselves in the shoes of the child. Like, how are they seeing this? How are they seeing with this? The fourth thing is the motives. What does my child want out of what's going on? What does my child want? That's a great diagnostic question. What does my child want out of what's going on? When you get to that level, that question, what are you seeing? You're seeing the motivation. You're seeing the heart. If you can figure that out, because then you can take Scripture, what God has already said, and apply it to their heart instead of just their behavior. And if we don't get to that point where we do that, all we have is behavior modification. And what do we say behavior modification is like? It's like a trained seal at SeaWorld or a dolphin, right? Is the dolphin's heart or seal's heart changed, motivated, or does it just want the fish that he's going to get, the reward? You know what I'm saying? Are we just going to be like, and I'm trying to say this in a provocative, negative way, just for sake of discussion here, but we shouldn't be satisfied with just, trained circus animals, if you will. Using the same strategy to train an elephant at a circus, to use that same strategy to train our children, should we? Are children made in the image and likeness of God? So do they have a heart, a soul, and are they motivated by certain beliefs? So why does the person, and I say why does the person because this is very relevant to many more relationships in our lives. Maybe you don't have children, they're left your home, you don't have contact. We can use these same questions in discipleship relationships with people all around us. Do you think David knew the situation about what was going on? Do you think David knew with reference to Absalom what the person was doing in response to what was going on? Do we think that David knew what Absalom thought about what was going on with reference to the rape of his sister, Tamar? Did David have any clue with reference to Absalom's motives? He's just so passive, and all these things just keep happening till eventually he's out of his household. And that ought not to be. And that's why we said one of the biggest things, if I could say everything, and I got to close, but if everything I've said, this whole sequence, if you walk away with one thing today that would probably make the most difference in your life and for the life of your family, you know what it is? We said it last week, is to be a good listener. All the things we've talked about is, if you're not a listener, you're jumping the gun. You really don't know what's going on. You don't really know the situation. If you haven't listened to see, the beginning of the sequence is listen, learn, lead. And that's for a reason. So if we can listen, you're going to have to get to know the members of our family. We're going to have to actually go out on date nights with our wives and let her pour out her heart and really know her. Have her as a companion and spend time with our children so we can see. Because we said that last week, the illustration is a father is like an archer whose child is the arrow, and he points him in the right direction with precision and accuracy in the direction you have to go so the child is right on target. You can't do that unless you know the child, know what their proclivities are, what their tendencies are, their predilections, what brings them joy, what they like, what they enjoy, all those things. We can't apply the gospel until we know them. Otherwise, the gospel application or Bible application is merely shallow and surface. Do you like it when people approach you with a surface pat answer? They haven't taken the time to hear what's really going on with you, and they just say, oh, you're saying it's pride. Moving on. You're prideful. Bye. Get it right, and we're good. It's like take 2 Bible verses and call me in the morning. Is that helpful? Or do you feel loved when someone treats you that way? Like you value them? So this is what, I want to say in large part that our society paints this as being emasculine. Like, oh, you're going to be into feelings and motives and get to know your child. That's so emasculine. No, this is what we're talking about this morning is the heart of masculinity. This is how a man becomes the hero of his own house. By digging deeper into the lives of his family members, his wife, his children, and by providing for them emotional needs, psychological needs, of course spiritual needs, financial needs, basic necessities of life, protect them from all the dangers of life. Because what happens with children, they don't see the dangers afar off, do they? In fact, they're enticed oftentimes by what we know to be very dangerous. That have lifelong consequences that are destructive, and our job is to protect them from that. And you can't just say, stop it. You can't just say, that's against the rules. You have to lead them through the mental process of arriving at that conclusion for themselves. You see that? For themselves, because isn't that exactly what they're going to have to do when they leave your house? Aren't they going to have to walk through all that themselves? And don't you want them to come to the right conclusions? If they haven't had years of practice with that at home, where you're walking them through the thinking process, you ask them questions, they respond. You ask them a follow-up question, they respond. You ask them another follow-up question, the Socratic method, if you will, to walk them through the thinking process, because we know children's minds, they're not fully formed until what age? 25. So do they need our help? in walking through it? Or do they just need a taskmaster say, hey, kids, stop. You're annoying me. You're getting on my nerves. You're always such a naughty kid. By the way, when we use those negative, say, hey, you're always this, you're always that, you're always this, what are we teaching the child? That they're that thing. You're so naughty, you always do this. And they say to themselves, you know what? I'm so naughty, I always do that. Instead of inspiring them and encouraging them to all the amazing things that they can be because God has given them the potential to be it, those things. So can we build people up and gospel them, or are we just going to tear them down and destroy them and actually speak curses into their life because we're just merely annoyed and selfish and won't take the time to lead our families the way that God has called us to? With destruction in our wake. David was a great man. He was. He's a mighty warrior, but he wasn't the warrior he could have been in his own household. That ought not to be the case for us. Jesus has given us the example. And what is the type of leadership that we lead, men? It's self-sacrificial leadership. We lay down our lives for our loved ones. We lay down our lives for our wives, for our children. So I'll end with this. Men, the key to being good husbands and fathers is having a close relationship with God, and secondly, being involved, active listeners. I want to have our closers come up. Man, I want to leave you with encouragement. I hate it when I'm done preaching, I feel like I've just discouraged everybody. I want you to be encouraged because you have great opportunity ahead of you. Are you still breathing? Everybody here still breathing this morning? Then you've got time. There's hope. There's time to act. The story's not over yet, is it? There can be a new chapter. The best chapters can be ahead of us. They don't have to be behind us. If you've lost romance in your marriage, can you be reminded of the romantic feelings you used to have? Those can be brought back. God can restore. If you have a brokenness with your child, can we have faith that God is able to restore that? And that restoration with our child, with our estranged family member, can begin with God changing us. Can we step up and be courageous? Can we just determine that, you know what, this is going to be a lifelong venture, and my family's not going to be destroyed on my watch. I'm not going to sit idly by and watch my family destroyed just because I was lazy or passive. I'm going to lead courageously, I'm going to take responsibility, and I'm going to invest eternally. So men, if you would like prayer, I'm going to have a prayer team come up. If anybody needs some encouragement this morning, I don't want you to leave here encouraged. I want to have a prayer team come up now, and if you just want prayer, if you just want to, hey, can you pray a blessing over my life? Can you pray a blessing over my family tree? You don't have to leave here without a blessing. There's no reason to. Some of you, the first act of courageous leadership is the courage to step out of your pew this morning and walk forward and say, you know what? I need help. I need help. Those words just don't flow off our tongue very easily sometimes, do they? I need help. But can I tell you, that is courageous. It's courageous to say, I can't do it alone, I need help. And God has provided the church to come alongside of us and to support us in this. Ladies, if you are struggling and you need some prayer this morning, you have struggles, you're enduring suffering, you say, I want to suffer well, come forward, get prayer. You don't have to struggle alone. We're just going to have time because I want you to have time to address God directly. It's awesome. See, God's working right now. See, healing has to happen. The brokenness has to be redeemed. And it should start with the church.